So if you say there's too much federal employees, well, tell me what you mean by too much. Are they protecting us against banks, or are they helping the big banks? Are they helping the military-industrial complex? Are they doing nothing at all? If you show me the waste, I'm very happy to cut it. But if you say, let's just pick a random number, 10%, 20%, 40% of the federal workforce and just cut it all, well, that doesn't make any sense. That you're telling me that you're doing a hatchet job. You're not going in there and actually doing what the American people.
All right, folks, buckle up because we've got an absolute firestorm of a debate to break down today. Uygur went head-to-head with a right-wing host on News Nation, and it was a brutal takedown. The topic? Federal job cuts, Elon Musk's reckless slash-and-burn tactics, and the broader fight over government spending. Cenk didn't just push back. He dismantled the argument that gutting federal agencies somehow benefits the American people, exposing the devastating consequences of slashing millions of jobs, crippling critical services, and destabilizing the economy. This debate wasn't just heated. It was a must-watch moment that laid bare the real stakes behind these policies.
Cenk Uygur joins us, founder and host of the Young Turks. Good to see you. I'm trying to figure out who thinks defending the federal bureaucracy and saying that money should just keep being spent ad nauseum in defending all of that is a winning strategy.
Yeah, I don't think anyone does, because literally no one is saying that outside of you. So if you want to talk about bureaucracy, the question is, how much regulation should we have? Well, that depends on the job at hand. There's no such thing as too much or too little regulation unless you know what we're regulating. In the case of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, they're regulating the big banks, and the big banks that have literally robbed their own customers. They've gotten $21 billion back for Americans, average middle-class Americans, who the banks were robbing, like Wells Fargo, who was ripping off their own consumers. So this is one of the places where you do not want to get rid of regulation. This is defunding the police on Wall Street. It's a terrible idea.
Okay, so that's Consumer Financial Protection Board. I'm guessing you have no problem with USAID and all the money that's being spent there. And I get it. There is a constituency for spending all this money and for all this regulation and for keeping all these federal employees on the payroll. Other than the far left, progressives, and federal employees, who is that constituency?
No, again, Leland, it depends on what you're talking about. So USAID has some programs that I don't love. And if you put that out there and go, hey, wait a minute, what is this program? Is this a CIA program? What's the actual point of this? That's terrific. Then let's look at it. Let's see if we want to cut it, etc. When you just cut the entire agency, hold on. There's some wonderful programs in there. There's money that goes to churches that help the poor, the needy, the sick, all across the world. There's a program that helps stop HIV in Africa that was actually started by George W. Bush. So this idea of just throwing out an entire agency is infantile. That's not how a rational populist would go about pruning the things that aren't working in the government.
You say a rational populist. I think that requires more examination. What do you mean?
Yeah, so I believe in populism. And yes, right-wing populists and left-wing populists actually do agree on a lot of things. There's also things that we don't agree on. But things we do agree on are, for example, anti-war. And so both sides are anti-war on the populist side, anti-corruption. And there's many others, including negotiating drug prices for Medicare. And at TYT.com, we have a whole plank where the whole country pretty much agrees to these 6.
Deregulation that serves corporate interests at the expense of everyday Americans. Uygur argues that smart, targeted regulations are essential for maintaining fair markets, preventing financial crises, and ensuring public safety. The CFPB's success in recovering billions for consumers is just one example of how oversight can protect people from corporate misconduct. Ignoring these benefits in favor of broad anti-regulation rhetoric not only misrepresents the issue, but also puts ordinary citizens at risk. The real question isn't whether regulation is good or bad. It's about striking the right balance to protect the public without stifling economic growth. Moreover, the debate exposed a fundamental flaw in the right-wing argument, the assumption that all regulations are inherently harmful to businesses and job creation. In reality, Well-crafted regulations provide stability and accountability, fostering an environment where both businesses and consumers can thrive. Without these safeguards, financial institutions could engage in reckless practices that lead to economic disasters, something we've seen in past financial crises. The push for deregulation often prioritizes short-term corporate profits over long-term economic stability, leaving taxpayers to clean up the mess when things go wrong. SUR also highlighted how industries with weaker regulations tend to see higher rates of fraud, exploitation, and environmental damage. The notion that eliminating oversight will automatically lead to economic growth ignores the historical evidence of unchecked corporate power harming everyday Americans. The discussion ultimately underscored the need for a nuanced approach, evaluating regulations based on their effectiveness rather than ideological opposition. Instead of blanket deregulation, the real focus should be on refining policies to ensure they serve the public interest without unnecessary bureaucracy that could leave ordinary citizens vulnerable to exploitation. Elon Musk and Donald Trump's push to slash federal jobs is another key issue raised in the discussion. While Republicans claim these cuts would make government leaner and more efficient, Uygur argues that this is nothing more than a reckless hatchet job. Blindly cutting 10%, 20%, or even 40% of the federal workforce without assessing their actual roles would mean gutting essential services that millions of Americans rely on. What Republicans fail to acknowledge is that federal jobs are a major driver of local economies. In many areas, the federal government is the top employer, and massive layoffs would devastate local businesses. When people lose their jobs, they stop spending, restaurants close, small businesses suffer, and entire communities decline. While conservatives like to frame the federal workforce as a bureaucratic swamp of lazy workers, the reality is that these employees keep everything running, from national security to public health programs, disaster relief, and infrastructure maintenance. If conservatives truly want to talk about cutting waste, they should at least be honest about the real-world consequences of mass job eliminations. Slashing jobs without a plan doesn't create efficiency. It weakens the economy, disrupts critical services, and harms everyday Americans. Instead of ideological attacks on the federal workforce, the real discussion should be about how to make government work better, not simply smaller.
So if you say to me, hey, look, there's corruption somewhere, great, point out the corruption,
we're
and I'm
talking
going to
about
vote with
stuff
you
that,
to get rid of it.
We're talking about stuff that polls at 70, 80%. And frankly, when it comes to government spending and a lack of a government efficiency, that polls at 70 or 80% as well. Here is Mark Cuban, obviously no fan of Donald Trump's, talking about what needs to happen to the size of the federal government.
As a libertarian, I think we can reduce employment in government by at least a third, reduce the overhead and administration by that much or more, so that we can offer more to services for our citizens. I'm happy to push down the size of government, and I'm happy to work on making government more efficient, because then more money can pass through and help the people who need it.
All right, so Cuban 2017. But the fact of the matter is that sometimes you have to break a few dishes, right? That was what Donald Trump, whether you like it or not, was elected to do. Again, Democrats championing all this and saying, oh, no, you can't fire any federal employees. They are sacred cows, as if they're here made of gold on the National Mall. Again, for people who don't like Donald Trump, aren't you just handing him more?
The discussion also brings in billionaire Mark Cuban's 2017 remarks on cutting 1/3 of the federal workforce to improve efficiency. Uygur acknowledges that government waste exists and should be addressed, but he also exposes the real problem with Republican budget cuts. They don't redirect the savings into programs that help ordinary Americans. Instead of using government reductions to fund universal health care, tuition-free college, or infrastructure improvements, conservatives push for more tax breaks for corporations and the wealthy. This is where the libertarian argument for smaller government falls apart. If the goal were truly to free up money for essential services, then spending cuts should be reallocated to benefit the public, not hoarded by the elite. Cuban's approach, while idealistic, assumes that government cuts will naturally lead to more efficient services, but in reality, Republicans often use those cuts as an excuse to dismantle social programs even further. The pattern is clear. Instead of reinvesting in policies that strengthen the middle class, the savings from job and program cuts overwhelmingly benefit the richest Americans, widening the wealth gap and weakening the social safety net.
So it depends. Everything depends. So if you say there's too much federal employees, well, tell me what you mean by too much. Are they protecting us against banks, or are they helping the big banks? Are they helping the military-industrial complex? Are they doing nothing at all? If you show me the waste, I'm very happy to cut it. But if you say, let's just pick a random number, 10%, 20%, 40% of the federal workforce and just cut it all, well, that doesn't make any sense. That you're telling me that you're doing a hatchet job. You're not going in there and actually doing what the American people voted.
Perhaps the most chilling takeaway from Uygur's argument is his warning that if the U.S. government continues down this path, it risks becoming hollowed out like Russia. He points to Russia's declining education system and crumbling infrastructure, which he attributes to Vladimir Putin siphoning public funds for himself and his inner circle. The parallels to the U.S. are hard to ignore. If the Republican strategy of slashing social programs while enriching billionaires continues, America could face a similar fate. The Republican Party, under Trump and his allies, isn't focused on governing efficiently or making government work better for the people. Their priority is defunding public services so that more wealth flows into the hands of the elite. This isn't just a policy debate. It's a fundamental question about whether America will remain a functioning democracy with a government that serves the people or whether it will be dismantled in the name of corporate greed. The stakes couldn't be higher.